Hey, what's going on, everybody? Coming at you here at end of July with my good friend Jonathan Pishner of Apex Counseling. And today's topic is one that everybody is, unfortunately a little too familiar with. And that is just, the experiences and the sensations of grief and loss. And I'm from home and the doorbell just rang. The guy walked away. But if you saw that, I was like, that never happens. And there we go. I don't know if you heard that. I was like, really? 20 seconds in. But anyway, yes, like I said, like this is something again, this happens in so many forms, shapes, and sizes. It's somebody that everybody is going to have to deal with and just learn to cope with and make it through to the other side. But also it's somewhere where a lot of us have the capability to help other people as well, is helping them through their own journeys of grief and loss, whether big or small. So I'll go ahead and hand this over to JP a little bit and let him get going.
Yeah, well, context-wise, we got onto this topic because when we were deciding what we wanted to talk about, I actually myself just recently experienced the death of a friend, so that's what got us on this. And it occurred to me that I get a lot of questions about how to handle it, but one of the things that I realized and have known for a long time is a lot of people know that there is a grief process, but they don't know enough about it to move through it as effectively as they can. Because a lot of people accidentally make up that you should be able to make yourself not feel sad or not feel as sad. And a lot of people make up that you should still be able to be productive even when you're experiencing grief and a lot of these things. So we decided we wanted to talk about it today because really this is less here is how you fix grief and loss and dealing with the 101 misconceptions about how you were supposed to deal with grief and loss, because there's just so many
Yeah.
kind of myths and misunderstood things about it.
Yeah. Well, since you already brought up the stages of grief, and like you said, most people knowing that at least they exist, um, I definitely find it's one of those things where people have an idea that because they've learned about something that thus means that they're either immune to it or that they can almost choose to go through it in a certain way. Do you find that a lot of people feel like I feel like a lot of people will try to self-identify a stage, like, oh, I am in the denial phase or I am in the anger phase, something like that. Do you get that a lot, and people feel like, oh, I'm here, so this will be next, like.
Yeah, and part of the problem with it is the stages of grief are quite good, but the original version got really good publicity, and the much better understood versions from later did not get nearly as good publicity. So
Mm,
everybody thinks it still goes in stages in that format. So, in the absence of really being prepared and like having some better way to show this, I hand drew a much more relevant
okay.
way of seeing it. So I'm going to try and
Nice,
there
I
we
love this. Okay.
hold on there we go.
Yeah,
All right. So
denial.
this
Ooh.
so this is really how it goes, because what happens is you can be in any of the stages and go to any of the other ones.
Yes.
And really, it's most easily conceptualized like almost like bouncing around them. There's this great graphic that I saw once of basically a ball bouncing around, almost what I drew there. And when grief is happening, at the very beginning, it's very rapid. The ball is moving very quickly. It's going to hit things in rapid succession. You can be angry one minute and feel guilty the next, maybe even feeling guilty over being angry. You can be sad. And if the grief process is done well and done right, what happens is it eventually, kind of slows down to the point. And the reason I had acceptance drawn at the bottom is because eventually it slows down enough, the ball just drops down and you're at acceptance. But here's one of the misconceptions is that once you get to acceptance, you should somehow just always be there.
Hmm.
There's stuff that can shake it up and get the ball moving again.
I've never seen that before, like the illustration you made, but that makes so much sense. And I'm glad that you introduced that
Yeah,
so
that
clearly.
precise version might be a JP original. It's adapted from some other things I've seen elsewhere, but this one might be a
Yeah.
original to me.
Yeah, but I do feel like that is so much an improvement because, like you said, like the way it's taught is so much in that classroom format of just linear progression. And when people see lists, we just automatically assume you go through the list. Like that's
Yeah.
it.
And
Like
that's the way we originally thought it happened too.
yeah, okay, that makes sense too. But yeah, it's like people think that once you go down, you're not going to go up, or forward, you're not going to go back, or they might think there's something wrong if you do. And but yeah, like just thinking about my personal experiences, I don't remember all of them for sure, but I don't remember any bigger sense of loss or like grief cycle where I only hit like some serious grieving once. Like I said, like there's that where I felt calm and it's like okay, like I'm functional again more than like once and was done. Just like you said, like it's
Mhm.
always seemed like it was like bouncing around until it just became more like the bad things became less frequent and the good things became more frequent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and actually, talking of being okay and then the ball getting shaken up again, probably this discussion is going to shake the ball up for me since my loss is so much more near. Like it'll probably get it moving again, and
yeah, um, yeah.
I'll experience something here in an hour, or a day, or who knows.
Yeah, I remember circa 4 or 5 weeks ago, when we were talking about making this one of the subjects. I mean, your words were along the line of you haven't actually hit the process yet, where it's really hit you. Like you said, like you were aware of that. You're like, like I'm still
Mhm.
just kind of like in a little bit of surprise and shock about it. But then you also had, um, like there was also one sense of that made it easier for you that you felt, like you had a really good feeling that your friend had lived a really good complete life, like in that time frame. Which, like, so actually, if you don't mind, go into a little bit how those types of perspectives, in a way, like will change these.
Yeah, so I kind of got lucky with mine in that it's going to be a very clean grief process for me. But there's a lot of things that can confound it because like my last interaction with my friend was good, but if it had not been, like maybe we argued over something, like that would make the grief process messier.
Mm,
If like maybe you know. I felt, if I'd known like, oh man, he had all these things he never got to accomplish, like that would probably make my own and everybody's grief process messier. I know at least one individual in that person's life who they were in a bit of a feud and like they had not spoken for some time. And so that person's grief process is extremely messy at this time and will be. It'll take them much longer to move through it. Uh, but just because it wasn't a nice, like they don't have that nice circumstance of, oh, everything was fine between me and the person. So there's a lot of things that can really confound it. And one of the things that's not obvious is some of the after stuff. So a lot of people sadly get embroiled in this thing that complicates the grief process where like, um, what do we do with the person's stuff? And especially if there's a dispute over that, like a lot of people get into legal
that gets
disputes over
crazy.
which is a good advertisement for heaven's sake, get your will done so your people around you have a cleaner grief process. Um, but yeah, that makes it horrifyingly messy if you have all this after stuff that then has to be taken care of. So I mean, and I could list for the next hour just confounding variables in the grief process, but
Yeah, man, yeah,
the
there are
cleaner
so
it
many
is, the easier it is.
things. Yeah, there are so many things in this. Like, I mean, just like you said there, I said, I know from my experience, actually, just that some people might be the type of thing, just like you said, there's a lot to take care of. I can see, like, I can see different extremes where you might be the type of person who snaps in and just is only focused on taking care of those things, and it's almost like you don't even have a grieving process until those things are done, and then you actually kind of go through it, kind of for like let yourself take it through it. On the flip
Mhm.
side, I'm sure there's people who go directly into the emotional response for a while and pretty much can't get much of anything done, even though a lot of that stuff unfortunately has timelines. Um,
And let me pause you there because you're saying something that's super important. I want to highlight it. Uh, a lot of people, because we have stages and because we have models and stuff, they think the grief process has to go a particular way for them. And the thing you're saying is, and that is absolutely right, is that it is unique to each person, and it's fine that it's unique to each person, and it's fine that it's messily unique to each person. So yeah, like what you're saying is absolutely right. Some people will get into it later or earlier. Some people will go straight into the emotions. Like yeah, I mean that's dead on.
Man, I'm making so many notes already for specifics like later on in this. Um, okay, so I mean, obviously for anybody who's picking up late or like currently we are talking like pretty specifically, and we will continue on this for a while about the type of loss from when you lose somebody, whether it's a friend, a family, etc. So we are talking about those things right now. So what are some of the more common? So okay, one that you said I want to point out again is you mentioned you yourself can at least try to make things better on other people by preparing for those moments. And I said that is one of those things like I'm gonna say this like people we as society, school, family, whatever you want to call it, are terrible at teaching people that they should do this. Like there are so many things about end of like whether it's end of life care after whether it's expected or not, old age, etc. That like so it can be get so messy if they're never thrown out there. I remember one for me like roughly not even a year and a half ago, when my mom got sick and passed away. Was I was staring at the options between basically like hospice care, someone at home, something like that. Like if she pulled through and made it. Um, but like I said, like there are things in that, like how expensive it is, it's crazy. But there's certain rules, like if they own anything, like for example, people are like, oh, I'll leave this, I want to have I want to have a home paid off so I can leave it to my kids, or things like that. They don't tell you that if you have that home and you pass away, or not pass away, but if you have that home and then you go need care, they will take that home and sell it to break it down for the care or everything you own before before figuring out what happens next or all that. Like
Oh
they in
God,
essence look at you as one massive slate of possible liquidation to do that. And there's a
gee,
certain year limit. There's like a 2 or 3 years out is when at that point if you are like getting older, want to set that stuff up and make that stuff, it's actually ideal that you're that 2 3 years out is when you start unloading your assets to your family members, because at that point they're far enough away, they're not considered yours. And so if those moments happen, they don't come after that stuff. So again, that's just a deep perspective of how nuts some of that stuff can be. But to summarize that,
and look at the dehumanizing aspect
oh
of that
yeah,
process.
absolutely.
Like oh my gosh, how horrifying is it to think that like you have to strategize your own death so as to not like overly burden the people that are left. Like, oh, I mean, what a no wonder people don't know how to deal with the grief process because number one, our society kind of like really doesn't do well with handling that in a human way, and number two, like I mean, it's hard enough to deal with on top of it. Like there's one of the things societally that like really feeds into the idea that people should get over it quick. If you happen to work at a place that actually offers bereavement leave, how long is it? 3 days? It kind of sends a subliminal
Yeah,
message. Yeah, yeah. Where I used to work, it was 3 days or two, maybe. That sends a very subliminal message of like, oh, 3 days, that's plenty of time to grieve. You should be over it now. Uh,
yeah,
which the real story is that the grief process for it to complete reasonably well takes bare minimum, absolute bare minimum 1 year, because you got to get through all the major holidays. You got to get through all 4 seasons. So like you got to deal with your first Christmas without the person, first birthday, um, And you've got to get through all the other major life markers that they would have been there for. So if there's a family vacation that y'all take once every 4 years, that now they're not on, like you've got most of the way through the grief process, but then 3 years later, now you still got to deal with the first family vacation that they would have been on. So like it actually continually will crop up sometimes. You can get most of the way through it in a year. And we pretend for clinical purposes, we'll be like, yeah, okay, you're done with the grief process. You're never really done because other stuff can continue to trigger
Oh,
it,
yeah.
but you're largely done within a year if things go well. If things don't go well, it can last significantly longer than that.
Yeah. Man, that's really good stuff. And wouldn't have thought about that. The milestones. That's a really good point to bring up. So we talked about the preparation that you can do to help others. Now, in terms of the actual person going through the grief cycle, what are some of those like tips and strategies they can actually put into action to get through it healthy and ideally, again, I don't want to say quicker, but just be able to function in the way that you want to, like faster.
There's a part of me that hates trying to explain this because it ends up being so ephemeral and abstract, and it relies on a person's felt sense, which during the grief process can't be trusted anyway. But I'm still going to do my best because I can't help it. I can't not. Uh, so, when I held up the little graphic there, like, so there's denial, sadness, guilt, and anger as the primary emotions that people will have a tendency to go through in the grief process. One of the things is trying very hard to remember that you are going to go through those and to not accidentally take certain parts of them as real. Like, let me focus on guilt because that's the most dangerous one. There's a lot of people who will very easily make up, I should have done more. I should have seen this person more. They'll somehow make up that the death is their fault. Like, oh, I invited them to come over and they died in a car crash on the way here. Therefore, it is definitely my fault. And one of the best things a person can do is if they know that guilt and inappropriate guilt is part of the grief process, they can be suspicious of those thoughts and not really let them set in too hard and know that that's like grief thoughts and that's not your real beliefs because
Mhm.
obviously, like if a person dies in a car crash on their way to your house, it is not actually your fault. But in your grief and in that emotion of guilt, you will accidentally make up that story. And that's just a part of it. But if you know that you're making up just stuff out of your grief, it's a little easier to be dismissive of that and like feel the emotions, but without taking on negative beliefs about yourself. But like I said, really that relies a lot on a person's felt sense, which is always difficult during grief. So I mean, this is one of the reasons a lot of times people get into counseling during grief for a little while just to have a third party help them sort through it.
Mm. Yeah.
But if you know that ahead of time, you can work through it still reasonably well on your own if you choose to. So that's one thing. It's just knowing what the process is going to be like. Like I live in a charmed situation where I had my friend pass, and I've had a decade of knowledge knowing what this is like. So I found out, and I was already pre-prepared. Like, so, oh, okay, well, as soon as this hits me, I already know what I'm going to go through.
Mhm.
So whenever like the emotions showed up, I was like, oh, hello, grief process, and I knew how to sort through it
Yeah.
very easily.
Seems crazy, but yeah, I can totally see that when you see your mind start to do its little magic dances.
Yeah,
Um,
but most people listening to this are not going to be in that quite
yeah.
so charmed situation, so it's much harder.
So something that a lot of people do, and I'm really could be curious to hear like we have to say about this first, and then how some people do it well versus others do it in a very poor way, is they immerse themselves in something. Whether it's throw yourself into work or I mean, obviously it could be, if it's obviously destructive, like, oh, I'm going to immerse myself in drugs or alcohol because of the grief, or it might be possibly productive or not, such as work. Or maybe it is just something like immersing yourself in something that is like, for lack of a better term, just good for you. But what are like some ways people might be able to do those types of things strategically or cut off bad ones faster?
So, again, relying on a person's felt sense. Balance ends up being important because, depending on how bad the pain is, distracting from it is appropriate. So doing things to distract from it, like, if just one day it's on you super hard and like, you haven't been able to break out of it for a couple hours, and it's just a day where playing 8 hours of Xbox is preferable to 8 hours of sadness, like maybe that's okay. Maybe that's right. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to like cover up the emotions entirely and fail to experience them because then you're blocking the grief process. But I mean, sometimes the pain is just so acute that it would be crazy to try and experience it. So like throwing yourself into stuff is fine. And to a certain extent, throwing yourself into things we would usually think of as negative coping skills can be maybe okay. Like binge watching Netflix, like, okay, I'm a little less against that whenever somebody's going through a grief process because sometimes you just need something to numb out a little bit. But there's always the risk of doing it too much. And if you block out all the emotions, all you're doing is you're locking them away and giving them a chance to like go into the closet and ferment and then come back out 5 years later, like way stronger. We call it complex grief or complicated grief. Whenever, that's one of the ways you can get into complicated grief is it just, you repress it for too long until it can't be repressed anymore. Then it's way worse than if you'd have dealt with it the first
Yeah.
time. But like I said, you notice I keep going back to like you have to rely on a person's felt sense of what's the right
Right.
balance, and that's hard.
Right. And I mean, I'm going to go right back there again. So something that in what you said when you mentioned actually between, like with your friend, where you're at versus, at least one friend or like, somebody had a feud with, what are, when somebody is struggling, ways you can help? It's like, in essence, when one person has closure versus somebody else has that open-ended, we didn't get to hash something out, something is out there, like and just, yeah, like what are ways to either help or navigate yourself through those situations or help somebody in that non-closure sense, because I imagine that's worse every time.
Yes, and one of the best things you can do is know that closure is almost always not available because we like to think of that. Oh man, if I'd only got to say this to him, and we imagine kind of this perfect final interaction that would have amounted to some level of closure. Um, Almost nobody gets that. Like, if I was to allow myself to go to that imagined final interaction, last time I saw my friend was at a group gathering. Didn't really talk to him that much. I mean, I didn't like avoid him or anything. Just that so happened we didn't like orbit each other for us to say more than a paragraph or two to each other. And if I wanted to let myself get into that, I could get into some version of, oh, I should have done this so much differently. Knowing that there's no such thing for most people as that perfect final interaction is really valuable because people make up what it should have been, and it almost never happens that way. Like one time in 2000, maybe. Like if somebody's dying and maybe they have a terminal illness or something, and you say that loving thing to them, and then they close their eyes and they pass away. Like, yeah, sure, every once in a while you get that story. Most of the stories don't really have
Mhm.
that. Like some of it will be, I treated somebody once for grief where their person died in a car wreck, and the final interaction was just like some banal, like, "Hey, pick up milk on your way home," and there wasn't even like a final "I love you" or anything. And people make up that like they should have done it differently, and if they had, therefore they would feel better and have closure. I really kind of hate the idea of closure because
Right.
people don't get it. People don't receive that enough for it to be a thing people should chase.
Yeah. The more we talk, I really do think that feeling of just that it was a complete, like I said, like circle relationship, like life of each other giving to each other. I feel like it's probably the best outcome. Um, so going into the past a little bit for most people on this, thinking about it as you were talking there, is, no, one of the top regrets that people have, like one of the top fields of regret that people have, is not taking the opportunity on lost relationships, whether
Mm,
it's friendships, things like that. And so many people, it's because of fear of rejection or it not going well if they do try to pick up on it. You know, because I remember reading in a book about regret. I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's by an author named Daniel Pink. But he mentions people who, like, might have been best friends all through high school, college, first few years after, for no real reason, just drift apart, that type of thing. Or maybe there was like a fight that, and then
mhm.
they do another thing, and they may both want to actually reach out to the other one for years and eventually decades, but they're so worried or afraid of what if the other person doesn't want to, is still mad, says they don't want to talk to them, that and instead they don't do it, and that becomes one of those, again, it's one of like the greatest human regrets apparently. And but
I buy that.
yeah, like so often, great book by the way. Like so often, people, when you do those things, they end up going, if not perfect, they end up going way better than you think. It's that type of thing. But you can really see in this conversation, I feel like the in a way that like greater final value of making those decisions. Those, I don't know if I should do this. I don't know if I want to. What if it doesn't go great? Because eventually, if there when that point hits when you literally can no longer reach out again, stoke those friendships, have those conversations again,
Mhm.
it will make this process much, much messier and longer lasting.
Yeah. So I mean, basically, what you're getting at is that for most people, even if it goes badly, rejection will feel better than regret, and that, to my experience as a counselor, does seem to be true. Like I have heard many times, people being rejected and people feeling regret for not reaching out to somebody. The regret for not reaching out always seems to be much more strong emotionally than getting rejected. So yes, the thing you're proposing, as best I can tell, is absolutely correct. I've never sat down and spreadsheeted it out, but it sure seems that way.
So what are some ways that you notice these cycles or people handle these emotions when the loss is like expected versus unexpected? Um, Yeah, like you mentioned, whether it's because of it, like
Mhm.
I feel like most cases would be involve disease in this situation as being expected, um, or somebody just being, like hitting really ripe old age. But when those two situations where, I mean, yeah, because like I've had a couple, I've been blessed where I've had a few family members make it like really long years, and but in a couple of them, I know, like, if their mind did not make it to the end, like whether due to Alzheimer's, dementia, something like that, it kind of already felt like, that it almost felt like the grief process had happened while they were still alive, to be honest.
Well, yeah, and let me split those two things into two separate ones. So, like, the primary thing a lot of people will accidentally do if the loss is expected but the mind is still present, is they'll actually do that exact thing we were talking about with closure. Is they'll accidentally make up what is this ideal final interaction,
Mhm.
and accidentally maybe set themselves up for a lot of extra grief when that doesn't happen, because most of the time it won't. The person will pass away in their sleep, and the thing they had idealized was that they would be awake, or who knows. There's so many ways it can go. So the thing I would encourage people to do is, like, if there's a loss coming and we know it's coming, don't accidentally come up with, here is what the ideal final interaction is. Instead, just maximize each one that you're having, and also allow space for there to be other things in your life. So, like, if grandma's getting ready to pass, but it happens to be taking, 6 months instead of the 2 months that we thought it was going to be, well, yeah, you still got to go to work. And a lot of people will beat themselves up that how terrible they are for going to work, or for, like, wanting to actually go and hang out with their friends and get some space from it. So, like, if a loss is expected, yeah, try and maximize every moment, but within reason. Balance again, right? Felt sense. Don't neglect everything just because you accidentally make up in your head that you should spend every single moment with this person, because that's not realistic. You have to actually also live the rest of your life and build them into it for the time they have left. But you brought up a thing I was definitely going to talk about, whether you asked about it or not. This is, whenever somebody's mind goes, this is a wonderful example of much more complicated grief. So
Oh, okay.
in my case, you know, it's much easier. One day my friend is alive, the next day he is not alive, and that's it. Grief process begins. Uh, in the case of a mind, there's several complicating factors that make it so much harder. Like my heart goes out to anybody who has to deal with this even once, God forbid, more than once. Because number one, sometimes people's mind comes back. So here we are already kind of grieving this person we lost, but their body is still alive. But then one day, especially in the case of Alzheimer's and dementia, they'll spontaneously sometimes be that same person. So now for an hour or 5 minutes or 30 seconds, they're back. And then they go away again and we lose them over again.
Mm.
And now we have like grief process number two kind of starting. And it really becomes much more painful having to deal with it that way, because here we have the person again and we're like, and immediately there's no fighting this. Immediately we have this hope of like, oh my God, I hope they stay around for like an hour, and then 3 minutes later they're gone again. That is way more difficult to deal with, and their body is still here no matter what. So here we have, okay, maybe grandma's mind went 3 years ago, so this person we actually loved is gone, but there's this other personality walking around in her body that looks like her, which makes the grief so much more difficult to deal with, even if her mind never comes back in that way. So it really extends out the grief process and makes it harder. Frankly, anybody going through that should make sure to have support from somewhere, either a grief support group, a counselor. Some people are just lucky enough to have amazing friends and family that can help with it, but that is a miserable grief experience.
That made
And
me shudder. Like when you were describing that as like that person coming back and having to deal with it's like I've never thought about that or apparently been in that situation as I hadn't thought about it. Like it gave me actual like shuddering just thinking about like I said going through
yeah,
that.
and I'll tell you, for anybody going through that, there's a thing that is absolutely perfectly normal, and you're not a horrible person. There is a massive sense of relief when the body finally dies. And that is perfectly fine, because finally the actual grief process can begin, and not this like, this other grief process that's way worse. Like finally we can just deal with the loss of the person. So anybody who has someone who loses their mind, almost 100%, if they have to deal with it for a while, there's a massive sense of relief. But then they think they're terrible because like they think it means they were
Yeah.
wishing for the person to die, and that's not true. They were wishing for this thing that looked like the person that they knew. They were wishing for it to go so that they could finally begin the grief process.
Yeah, that's true. And a little side note that I actually want to throw into this is this is a kind of a philosophical decision, and everybody's there's no right or wrong answer here. What I'm about to say, but when a person is like I said mentally is in the throes of Alzheimer's, dementia, something, and again like that part is no longer quote unquote there or not there often. I personally am of the belief, and I'm going to give other people the permission as well for me, that you do not need to put that person into the grief process because they're almost in a well, the situation they're dealing with through dementia does not
Mm,
necessarily mean that they need to be updated on reality. Period. I said like everybody's got their own opinion, but for me, my grandma outlived both my dad and my uncle like on that side. but she was deep into, like, at that point she'd been in a nursing home and she'd been several years into dementia, to a point where she was lucky in, I mean, I'm going to say that I don't know, I'm not an expert, but she had what seemed like happy Alzheimer's. Like, she was almost always in a good mood, would think I was some kid she would play with when she was 10 years old. Like, and we visit her and be like, this is awesome, this is great. It's like, rather than like some of the ones who aren't in and don't seem to be in a joyful state like that. But thinking about it, I was like, I'm never going to tell this woman that her sons have passed away. Like,
And actually, just so you know, this is not really just your opinion. This, to the best of my knowledge, is the present philosophy on how to deal with Alzheimer's in a clinical setting.
well, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, because I said, I was like, I'm not good. Because that part of me is like, man, like, I feel like you should tell her. But again, it's like, that's not quote unquote her that you're telling. That's it. And yeah. So I just wanted to bring that up. There's thing. This is like, there's no reason.
yeah. The present way of dealing with it, the present thought process is that um, that's really more destructive than anything. The last time I read anything on it, which was a few years ago, was kind of like, if they say, let's take your grandma for example, and she names, one of her sons who passed, hey, is he going to come and visit me? It's kind of better to just work within their present understanding of reality and say, I'm sure he'll be here in a little while, or, I'm sure he will soon. Which sounds kind of mean, because in one sense you're lying by omission, if nothing else. But to the best of my knowledge, that's the present way of dealing with it. But that was from several years ago, so I want to leave space for the clinical information to have been updated.
So what would be some ways to help somebody help a younger person through grief? Like
Tell you what, let me say a few things for the person trying to help for any age to be cautious of. Because here's the thing: when people start going through a grief process, we are looking at another person in pain. So if I'm watching somebody grieve, my first instinct is to try and get that person to not be in pain. And what will happen? A lot of very, very well-meaning people will accidentally do very unskillful things because they're trying to get a person out of pain, not realizing that that's not possible. And that usually comes in the form of saying things that, if you really thought about it, would not maybe be very helpful. Some of the trite phrases. Oh, she's in a better place now. I mean, it's nice that you're trying to be helpful, but most people find that to be meaningless. Most people find that to be, at best, a little bit thoughtless. Um, Wow, of course I'm going to blank on them while we're sitting here on a live cast. But what are some of the other unskillful phrases people say? They'll try and explain away the pain, like, well, really, things are better now that they've passed because she had all these things and she's not in pain anymore. These are really not usually very helpful. What is much more helpful, instead of trying to like get a person out of pain, is viewing the pain is going to be there. So how do we caretake somebody who is in pain and who is going to be in pain? Well, number one, we change what we say to them first of all. The second, one of the things we do is we actually take care of them, sometimes physically. Like, we bring them food. We make sure they're eating. They're exhausted. Okay, well, let me take care of the kids. You go lie down. Take a nap. It'll be okay. So taking care of somebody physically is a wonderful way to help with grief. You go over and you see your friend who's grieving, and they haven't been able to clean their house in 2 weeks. They just can't get up the gumption. Asking permission to make sure. But like, hey, would it be okay? Can I help you clean up? Like you stay here and watch a little bit of Netflix. Let me at least like do the dishes for you. That could be, and here's the thing: even if they say no, that is a gesture that is often received well, because even if they don't want you touching their stuff, maybe like, just they can't stand the idea of that for some reason, that gets received well because they understand you're trying to caretake them and you're not being dismissive of them. There we go. That's the phrase I was trying to come up with. A lot of the phrases people say to others is a little too dismissive, or excuse me, it's received that way. It's not sent that way, but it's received that way. Like, oh, don't feel sad. Don't feel sad. They're in heaven now. You know. Yeah. Well, okay, great. If you believe that, then that is good, but it still doesn't take away the person's immediate pain of loss, because
Mhm.
just knowing that conceptually, if even if you believe in heaven, does not change what the grief process is. But if you kind of just sit with them in their grief, like, what do you do for a person who's crying? You usually hug them. You let them cry on your shoulder. You don't say words at them to try to make the crying go away. Now, with the guilt, sometimes you may be verbally, if they say, "Oh, it's all my fault," sweetie, it's not all your fault. And you might explain that a little bit. That maybe makes some sense. If they're going through anger, like, don't tell them not to be angry, because number one, that's not an option, because grief is what grief is. You're going to be angry. Uh, but you can help them make a little space to be angry. Like, uh, you live on a piece of property where this would be an option. Like, hey, take a stick, go out and beat some trees, just get it out. Like, help them make space to express their emotion however they got to express it. Me and my hobbies. Like, I've got punching bags downstairs. If somebody's over at my house and is having like grief, anger, I'll like take them downstairs and let them wail on the punching bag. But making space for them to have their emotion instead of trying to make the emotion go away is really the key here for anybody trying to help with grief. Caretaking the person as much as you can, like help them with tasks. That's really what it's about.
That's yeah, like super valuable for anybody.
Yeah.
Um,
And now I can't remember what your question was, because you're
no,
asking something about young people, and
like
now I'm
what
now I'm lost.
basically like helping young ones, because I feel like this would be, especially when you got really, without going too crazy rabbit hole, got two different situations here in my mind. One is too young to understand, but knowing that something is wrong, somebody's gone or somebody's passed away, or being just young enough to understand. Like, I feel like, those two parts of growing up, like, hey, like, you're not going to see grandma, grandpa again, or like, hey, your dad was in a terrible accident, something like that. He's not going to be making it home. But
Mhm.
those types of things, yeah, when they're, like I said, like so young to where, I mean, this would be hard for anybody. This would be hard for a teenager, but especially, like I said, kind of in that before and after understanding hits in those young ages, which, I mean, you know better than me, but somewhere in those early middle single digits. uh,
Mhm.
but yeah, like kind of just ways that family people can help, like kids in essence, navigate this.
Yeah. So this is and back to balance, right? The thing that the mistake that is traditionally made is not being honest enough.
Hmm.
Uh, it is important if you're unfortunate enough to, like, be 2 or 3 years old, and somebody close passes, like maybe a parent. I mean, it is the remaining parent's responsibility to explain that in a way that makes some kind of sense and is fully true. Like, a lot of parents, trying
Yes.
not to say words like dead, will say things like, "Daddy's not coming home."
Yeah.
And yeah, you heard how that message could get received.
Hmm.
Now, a loving, caring parent who is in their own grief process and says something like that unskillfully, like, I don't want to like beat anybody up for that. But that is a message that is not as fully true as it could be. And it leaves a lot of space for a child to misinterpret it. So, one of the most important things is to explain as clearly as possible what has happened. And you can do it gently. But it's kind of like, if we had to give medicine to a small child, and they didn't want to take it, we would have to, as carefully and kindly as possible, make them take it, right? Like,
Mhm.
and it's the same thing here. When you got to explain the truth to a child, you want to give it to them as kindly and as gently as possible while it is still the thing they need. So they need to understand that it's death. They didn't just not come home one day. They need to understand, like, that it wasn't that person's desire. Um, there's some stuff that, like, it, I would have trouble giving out generally, and like I would really want to sit down and talk to people about it case by case. But let's say, you got a single digit kid and a parent dies by suicide.
Ooh.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Now we have to figure out, like, exactly how much of the truth to give them and how much of it they're ready for. So, like, the more complicated it gets, the harder this gets real quick. But for the general listener, let's stick to the cleaner ones because I can give more general advice. Just making it true, making it as true as possible, gently giving it to them, leaving a lot of space for them to ask questions, and making sure that you make that space not just at the time you're explaining it to them, because they're not going to think of questions right then. What's going to happen is 4 days later, they're going to ask you something. And if you're accidentally in the throes of, like, trying to get stuff done, a lot of parents thoughtlessly answer some of these very important questions. Like, let me see if I can think of one off the top of my head. Oh, here's a great one. Why do people die? That's a question a child would ask. And if a parent thoughtlessly answers that, well, that just happens, and goes on with what they're doing. Right. Yeah. But I mean, imagine if I'm trying to do the dishes and I'm trying to get
Yeah.
out the door, how easy would it be to thoughtlessly give that answer? But now you've accidentally, like, maybe made death a little more of a close looming specter than it
Yeah.
needs to be.
Exactly. It's like, oh God. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, the thing you would do with children is also make sure to be very conscientious of when they ask you stuff. Think through what you're saying, slow down what you're doing, and make space to actually talk to them,
Yeah.
and not just lob them stuff and hope that they get it, because they don't have adult brains. Like, you and I can be like, well, yeah, okay, death just happens sometimes, and we can both know what each other means, and that's fine.
Mhm.
Kids ain't going to hear it that way.
Yeah. I was going to add to that, and it's part of what you said at the that last point was also purposefully choose to be vastly more patient in those situations.
Yeah.
Because like I said, that can go with again, like actually thinking of your responses each time and not just firing it off, but emotionally and with attention, like would be the other one. Yeah, because it's like some of the things, like some of the basic things, may be off kilter for a while. Like I said, if they're not cleaning up after themselves, they're making more messes. They're just like things like that, or behavioral patterns, etc. So you're, very likely to be off for a
Mhm.
while as part of that process for the kid. And so like actually realize and think I am going to be more patient than I would maybe normally be to help through the situation right now.
Yeah. And I just realized there's another one important to mention, uh, especially for kids of any age. Don't pretend you're not going through the grief process. Your
Mm.
kid walks into your room and sees you crying and says, "What's wrong?" And you, like, wipe quickly. Oh, nothing's wrong. Way wrong message, because now you've accidentally said, "Oh, what you're supposed to do is hold your emotions inside and not let people see them." It, if your kid catches you being sad, be truthful. Like, yeah, mommy's sad right now. Uh, it gives you a chance to talk to them about how to appropriately express the emotions of grief. And it doesn't accidentally send the message that emotions are bad or should be hidden. But we as adults, like in most of our roles, we are supposed to hide our emotions. Like, if you're if you're going through the grief process, but your job is to sell, I don't know, cars, like you can't be all teary-eyed on the parking lot, trying to sell a car. So it's understandable how we get into this mindset. But when your kids are around, you want to have the awareness that you do it differently and you show things differently.
Mhm. There's a heavy one. There's a heavy one. Um, so closing it up, I mean, not really like as a lighthearted note isn't the right way to put it, but a one thing is, the close. I can't think of the right way to say it, so I'll just say it.
Actually, hold up right
Right.
there. Right, I want to use that to point something out.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful example of, because we're starting to move into closing, and how in this case closure is not going to be clean. It's going to be messy. We have lobbed a heavy subject into
Yeah.
the internet, and there is no nice ribbon to wrap around it. It's more like, here's some information about grief. This is really hard, and we wish you the best of luck in figuring it out. And like, I mean, it's going to be a messy closure, and that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I was going to say is, if you catch yourself finding of grief that is a skill in a way, aka something that you have gone through before and are finding yourself going through it better, for lack of a better term, that is probably a good sign that you are dealing with things well. Because I mean, I had my big ones are my parents. And I mean, I had 15 and a half years between losing the two of them. But my dad, which was first, was actually the expected one.
Mm.
And my mom, which was early last year, was the unexpected one, even though it was much later. But the act of having been through it before, and all that. I mean, definitely, like it still helped navigate those things some. And whether I was catching myself in a period of numbness or yeah, like non-productivity and just needing to shut off for a while, things like that, was able to identify those things and just be like, okay, like I get it. It's just going to take time, and just like dealing with it honestly, like you said, and going through it
Mhm.
like that. So
Yeah, and I'm so grateful. At least you kind of already knew, like, oh yeah, okay, this is going to take me a while. I don't need to be Mr. Productivity today. Let me just get what I can done and be done.
yeah, I tell you what, when my dad, well, actually, when we thought my dad was passing, because it actually was a weird 2 week thing, um, where like got the message and then he recovered a little bit, which actually allowed him to pass in a better situation later, which was nice. But I remember that phone call, and it was like I was at work back then, and before the business, and I remember like the first coworker who came in like right after that phone call, was like, "You okay?" And told him, he's like, "Dude, get out of here." He's like, that was literally the first message I got, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna do that." So couldn't have been like that. Couldn't have been a much better situation. But
Oh yeah, because man, how many people are in situations where they're like, oh, your mom died? Well, okay, you can have an hour off, but we need you in here at 9 instead of 8. Like,
yeah, exactly something like that. So definite value there of being in one of those situations where you're in a like we'll figure it out type of community. Basically, 'cause that's
yeah,
basically
yeah.
what it was like like no matter what it is, like we'll get it done, we'll figure it out. So
Yeah,
um,
how valuable, and man, that's a good testament to, like, when you found people who can help you through that, you're with good people. If you're working for a company that's sensitive to that, geez, man, that you're maybe in a good spot.
mhm. So, all right, brother. I mean, like I said, I think like I said this something like every single person that hears this can get something out of it. Um, said so. So I'm just gonna end it. All right.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Closure is a myth, so we'll just close with
yeah, we'll see you
thanks
guys next.
for
Like we'll see you guys
listening.
later. Bye.